some people say, oh, did it take 2 whole years to write one work? But the poor man was still earning his living, teaching 3 schools, and having spent all day in a school, would then get onto a bus and go to Morley College and teach his grown-up amateurs, choir and orchestra, composition classes in the evening. And the only time he had for composing then was at weekends and in the month of August. So if you think of the planets written in weekends in the month of August, it's astonishing that way round that it was done so quickly. It was the popularity of the planets that changed people's opinions about my father's music. And gradually in the early 1920s, he became what he hated being, a popular composer.
Gustav Holst was born in this house in Cheltenham in 1874. It's now the Holst Museum. His grandfather had come to England from Riga early in the 19th century, and the family was a musical one. Holst's own father, Adolphus, was known as a pianist, organist and conductor, and as a promoter of concerts in Cheltenham.
He was practicing Mendelssohn to give a concert in the Rotunda at the time when my father was being born in the next room. And so Mendelssohn's music, played right, would have been the first thing that greeted my father's ears when he was in the cradle.
But Gustav only lived in this house for 7 years. Most of his life and work were spent away from Cheltenham, but he never lost contact with the town of his birth, nor it with him.
He was very excited about it when the news broke that in 1927 the people living in Cheltenham wanted to honor him. As he said, how sensible of them, instead of waiting till I'm dead and putting up a monument in a churchyard somewhere, they'd actually asked for 2 concerts of my music and are collecting money to pay for a first-rate orchestra to perform in the town hall at Cheltenham. I was thrilled, of course, with the rehearsals and the performances. And they'd come up to me and talk to me about my grandfather, then about my great-grandfather. And it seemed to me most extraordinary, that continuity of the family in Cheltenham.
Holst's mother died when he was 8. His musical talents were encouraged by his father Adolphus, who was organist and choirmaster of All Saints' Church in Cheltenham. This was an early influence, Victorian church music in its heyday, the beginning of a musical upbringing that took him on to the Royal College of Music in London.
He used to go to the 3 Choirs festivals whenever he could manage it. Even after he'd left living in Cheltenham and was having lodgings in London as a student at the RCM, he used to come home and he'd always try and get to whichever of the 3 cathedrals it was. And the year in the early 1890s, when it was in Worcester, he heard Bach's B minor Mass, and that was one of the great experiences of his whole life. He got so excited that he found that his head was about to bump the roof. And he remembered holding on, gripping the sides of the chair to prevent himself bumping his head on the roof. It sounds crazy, but anyone who has got really excited in listening to great music will understand what he meant.
From college, he went to Wick Risington in the Cotswolds, where he was organist in the church.
Wick Risington was his first professional job. Of course, if I say that he had an annual salary of £4.10, it is very difficult nowadays to believe that that's possible. But it was a very good job for him because it was very good experience. And he got to love the Cotswolds round Wick Risington very much. He used to walk there and bicycle. It was in 1895, that's the year he got his scholarship, that he first met Vaughan Williams. And they immediately became great friends and remained great friends right up to the time my father died. And from the very early times when they were at college, they got into the habit of meeting as often as possible and playing through their compositions to each other when they were still in the half-written stage and criticizing them. And that was, I think, possibly the most helpful thing in music that happened to my father throughout his whole life. Vaughan Williams began working on the English hymnal in 1903, and he finished by 1906. And during those years, he asked several of his composer friends to write hymns for this book. And he asked my father, who did 3, and the one that was best known was In the Bleak Midwinter.
Snow has fallen, snow, snow, snow on snow. In the bleak midwinter, long ago. Our golden cannot hold him, nor earth sustain. Heaven and earth shall flee away when he comes to reign. In the bleak midwinter, stable place abides the Lord God Almighty.
One of the first things that he wrote, founded on folk songs, was his Somerset Rhapsody for orchestra, which begins with his favorite folk song and then introduces several more. And I think that is a great link with his love of the Cotswold Hills.
In his early years as a composer, Holst scraped a living as a trombonist, playing in a variety of theatre pits and on the end of the pier.
So many people have asked me, why on earth the trombone? Now, the first reason was that when he was a child, he'd had asthma. And in Cheltenham, there was an enlightened doctor who suggested that as he was such a musical boy, he should learn the trombone so that the breath control needed to play beautifully would help to cure his asthma, because he'd then breathe properly and in a controlled manner, and it would be almost a matter of life and death not to spoil the musical phrase he was playing. And when he'd learnt the trombone, he never had asthma again.
In this setting of the hymn to Vena from the Sanskrit poems of the Rig Veda, Holst the scholar wrote not only the music but the words as well. He learnt Sanskrit in order to make his own translations.
He used to say of himself that he was never a real Sanskrit scholar. He always cheated. He always had not only the dictionary, but several cribs so that he could see what other people had said.
Holst composed most of his later music in a soundproof room built specially for him at St. Paul's Girls' School in London. He'd given up the trombone to become a schoolmaster, numbering his daughter Imogen among his pupils. It was his way of supporting his composing.
It wasn't a burden because it was really a part of his musical life. He was very good with human beings, so that his pupils weren't wretched little creatures to get through the next 40 minutes with, ever. They were people who he was interested in, not just from a musical point of view, but as individuals. And therefore, teaching was very important to him, and he linked it with his own compositions, works such as the St. Paul's Suite for strings, which he wrote for the school orchestra when they were really quite bad. They'd only just begun. Of course, it's no good pretending we kept in tune, and it's no good pretending that we could play the St. Paul's Suite up to time. But when he conducted it for us, he was such a good teacher and such a good conductor of amateurs that the music made sense. Of all our years together, I've only once known him angry with me. I remember it vividly. I was in my first year at the Royal College of Music doing piano as a first study as well as composition. And I was visiting him in his soundproof room, and we were having a break, and he said, "Well, what are you learning And I said, Mozart, D major, this one. And I leaned across from where I was sitting, there was the keyboard, and I played the beginning, the first couple of bars of this little 6/8 tune, casually. And of course, it hadn't got the rhythm that the music needed and that had been in Mozart's mind. And he was really angry and said, oh, but rhythmically, where's the rhythm? And I had to move round and play it properly. It was in 1914 that he began writing The Planets, and this is a thing that people refuse to believe, but it's absolutely true that he wrote the music of Mars before the 1914-18 war had begun. He finished Mars in the spring and early summer of 1914, and then went on to the other movements during the next 2 years. He said, you know, I don't think there's any hope of this being performed in wartime. It's such a vast orchestra. He knew it would be very expensive. But a marvelous thing happened in 1918. One of his friends was the composer and patron of music, Balfour Gardner. And Balfour gave him a present of a rehearsal with the new Queen's Hall Orchestra and Adrian Bolt conduct, and that was wonderful experience.
But Holst also believed in encouraging amateur music making. In this house, he conducted the Hammersmith Socialist Choir. One of its members was his future wife, Isabel.
She had a very, very kindly personality. She was very practical. She could cook superbly. She came from a family in Fulham, local to Hammersmith, who were hard up, and there was nothing she couldn't do to make a home comfortable. And that was one of the things that my father appreciated so much, the practical side of someone who was kindly, understanding about his wanting to be alone and quiet when he was composing, of course, and being a superb cook and a superb manager, managing to live very well on a very small income as it was to begin with.
In 1914, the Holsts moved to Thaxted in Essex, where Gustav befriended the local vicar, Conrad Noel. By 1916, he was organising in the church a sort of impromptu festival.
There were no tickets, and the only audience was the congregation who came for the church services. And then the music would happen during those services. And those festivals gave him as much joy as anything in the whole of his life. And he wrote some of his best music for it. If I say best, I mean best musically, not best in vastness. There was a wonderful short part song called Tomorrow Shall Be My Dancing Day, which he wrote for Thaxted, medieval words which the vicar of Thaxted had copied out of a book and pinned up on the inside of the church door. And my father, when walking round the church, happened to see them and read them and set them to music.
Sing, oh my love, oh my love, my love, my love, this have I done for my true love.
In a manger laid and wrapped I was, so very poor this was my chance, betwixt an ox and a silly poor ass, to call my true love to the dance. Sing, oh my love, sing, oh my love, my love, my love. This have I done for my true love.
It was while he was walking round Thaxted Church in the intervals of one of our festivals, I think it was in that very first festival, 1916, that he heard one of the students from Morley College walking round the church, which otherwise was empty, playing her violin and singing a wordless song which she was making up as she walked very slowly round the church. Now people say how extraordinary, but of course she was only playing open strings, and it was a very simple tune that she was inventing. But he was thrilled with the sound of the voice and the violin, and as a result he wrote his 4 songs for voice and violin, which are among his most beautiful works.
I sing of a maiden that matchless is, King of all kings to her son he is. He came also still where his mother was, as dew in April that falleth on grass. He came also still to his mother's bower, as dew in April that falleth on flower. He came also still where his mother lay, as dew in April that falleth on spring. Mother and maiden with but she, well may such a lady God's mother be.
My father had very individual ideas about holidays. He liked walking, and he mostly had walking holidays alone. And that has given the wrong impression to some people who didn't know him. They think he must have been unsociable. But of course, he had comparatively little time for composing. And ever since he'd been a child, he'd found that the physical sensation of walking helped in the rhythm of making up music in his head. And so he chose to walk alone a lot. Sometimes he walked with old friends, but mostly his walks were alone.
Egdon Heath, a late orchestral work inspired by a sentence from Thomas Hardy's Return of the Native.
He had always been fond of Hardy's writings, and it was the vast solitude of what Hardy described as the impersonal open space that was really where my father was most at home in mind and spirit. Not long ago from one who'd been his pupil at the age of 8 and never forgot the passionate way that he taught them to sing a very simple folk song with a question and answer, absolutely in rhythm and with very clear words. And that has been in her mind ever since. She's an old woman now. And there are others like her who remember how he helped, not only just teaching them to do music, but how he helped without ever saying anything about it, how he helped them to realize that music is a part of life that can't be done without.